So I'm actually
Yeah.
curious, can you tie together, because today's, Wilson was super racist. He was obviously pro-war, and today's progressives build themselves as the super anti-racist, the super anti-war people. So what is the line? Because when I say progressive, people get confused, right? They see AOC and Bernie Sanders as progressive. And Bernie Sanders with his new Yemen bill, like Bernie Sanders put out a bill I'll support to end supporting the war in Yemen. So how do you tie the line from Wilsonite progressivism to like modern progressivism?
Yeah. Okay. Well, I would say, like I think I mentioned back towards the beginning of our conversation, that in my opinion, there's always been sort of like two, I don't know whether to call them like factions or camps or tracks or what within American progressivism that you can trace all the way back to at least the start of the 20th century. And there's the dominant strain, which I would call corporatist progressives. And I would include both Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson in this. And those types of progressives, which I would consider the kind of DNC establishment today to be the descendants of in most ways. Um, though it's gone through different iterations for sure, like a modern day progressive, even a corporatist progressive, doesn't believe exactly the same things that Woodrow Wilson or Teddy Roosevelt did.
Right.
But I think there's clearly a line of descendants there. And the corporatist establishment kind of dominant progressives, they're they tend to be very hyper interventionist on foreign policy. Now, occasionally one of them, like Teddy Roosevelt, will actually talk like a right wing war hawk on foreign policy. Most of them will sound like Woodrow Wilson, who gives these very idealistic sounding, non warmongery sounding speeches, but then is a trigger happy interventionist. He's like the original liberal internationalist interventionalist. And I'm going to be doing in the fairly near future, maybe before this month is up, we'll see. I'm going to be doing a bonus episode just for the folks who support me on places like Patreon and Subscribestar, all about Woodrow Wilson's so-called banana wars, all of his interventions in Latin America and the Caribbean, which often get very short attention because all of his big domestic stuff kind of dominates his first term, the Federal Reserve Act and all that. And then World War One dominates his second term, and really even the latter half of his first term. And so flying under the radar is the fact that he was a trigger happy interventionalist even before getting America into World War One in Latin America and the Caribbean. And he invaded Mexico twice. And he was running, like occupation in Haiti, a whole bunch of other places. A lot of the wars that Smedley Butler was involved with, by the way, when he was still a Marine officer. And but he always, unlike Teddy Roosevelt, who would talk like a John Bolton or Mike or John McCain, almost said Michael Bolton. Um, uh, Unlike Teddy Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, while he's invading all these places in Latin America and the Caribbean, he's talking all this, dove sounding language of, oh, we're just going to help uplift these people and this is humanitarian and blah, blah, blah. So that I would say is the dominant strain of progressivism. And I believe you can kind of trace a straight line of descendants from somebody like Woodrow Wilson through somebody like FDR, through somebody like LBJ, right on up to the Clinton, Joe Biden, et cetera, like that. And also, those types of progressives tend to be, again, despite their rhetoric, they tend to be historically terrible on civil liberties, and they tend to be, again, despite their rhetoric, which often they'll rail against the power of big corporations, and yet in practice, you can see that that's clearly who they're working for and in bed with and whatever like that. And then you've got this, more independent, or I don't know what you would call it, less dominant strain of progressivism, which are the progressives I tend to have more sympathy with, even though, I don't agree with them on everything with economics and some other issues. But their anti-corporatism is sincere. I don't always agree with their solutions to that problem, but sometimes I do. But their anti-corporatism is sincere. Um, they tend to be pretty good, if not great, in some cases, on basic kind of individual civil liberties. They also tend to be genuinely anti-interventionist, anti-war, and are much more consistent on that. And they also, there's a number of issues where you can kind of litmus test who are the good progressives that are actually worth talking to, and who are just the blue pill DNC NPCs. And one of the issues would be like the CIA. Another issue would be the FBI. Another issue in our day would be lockdowns. Another issue would be overseas wars, the war in Yemen, or the war, any of these wars really. Um, and then also, like, should we bail out Wall Street? Should government subsidize giant corporations and have all these huge regulations that smother smaller competitors and whatever? Those types of progressives tend to be more or less on our side on a lot of those issues, even though we might still disagree about healthcare or whatever.
Sure. Those progressives, though, have no power at all, right? The progressives
Exactly.
that it's the same as libertarians. Is like,
Yep.
they might have some of the right ideas, but they have no power to get it implemented because they don't
Yeah.
believe in using coercive state powers to get things done, right? If you have any libertarian instinct, and there are left libertarians who, will disagree with them on economics, and they think, communal anarchism is the best, where I'm sure you and I are both much closer to the ANCAP side of that argument. But what's interesting about the socialist progressives, the honest ones, the Ben Burgesses and people like that, is they do have a much longer view of history than the Clinton type progressives. I think they're wrong that they think, it's entirely class struggle all the way back to, the feudal stages, but they actually do have a historical perspective. So I think they can get more things right because they're taking into account more information, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And I think those people, I think they're, mistaken on certain issues, but like, I don't think they're bad people
Right.
in the way that I would think like an establishment progressive is a bad person. And I think that they also, on some level, they take the idea of democracy seriously and somewhat more literally. And so in that way, they're more comfortable with populism than the establishment progressives. The establishment progressives, since Woodrow Wilson's day, have always hated populism, whether it's nominally left or nominally right populism. They've always hated populism. And so, one of the functions that Wilson served, whether he consciously realized it or not, and one of the reasons why powerful people, even when he was still at Princeton University, started to kind of groom him to eventually run for president, is that he performed the function ultimately of wresting control of the Democratic Party away from the populists, led by William Jennings Bryan, towards the progressives. And, the populists in some ways are sort of also like these better independent progressives, where like they genuinely believed in democracy in a real sense. They tended to be better on civil liberties issues. They tended to be better on war issues. They weren't always consistent on those things, but certainly better than Wilson was. And so, yeah, this is why the establishment of progressives today, they hate Trump and the Trumpian movement so much. And they also, pulled the plug on Bernie Sanders when he started to really get some traction in 2016 and again in 2020. And, to Bernie Sanders' discredit, he then, broke and genuflected and whatever like that. And, I lost a lot of respect for him then. But
it turned out he had no spine. Like
yeah,
he had good rhetoric on some things, and then just no spine to stand up to the Clintons at the end of the day. And so he's
yeah,
useless.
yeah, yeah,
Even
yeah,
as I want good opponents on the other side making good arguments so we can have the battle of ideas and actually come to the right conclusions. But if you're just going to bend the knee at the end of the day to the powers that be, like, you're useless. You're useless in history. He's not going to have any impact. It's sad because you want somebody like him fighting for those ideas. I mean, we could beat him on the ideas, I think, but I want somebody making the best case possible, and he's incapable of doing it.